The afternoon sun stretched golden fingers across the pavement, draping the park in a warm glow. Laughter echoed, not in sound, but in movement. A group of deaf children gathered in a quiet corner, their hands weaving stories in the air, their faces alive with unspoken joy. Their world was silent but not empty. Among them, a golden retriever sat still, watching. His amber eyes followed their hands, his ears twitching with every shift in their fingers. This was no ordinary curiosity. This was understanding. Mia, a small girl with dark curls framing her face, hesitated. She had always been the quiet one, the observer rather than the leader. But something about the way the dog watched them, not like a pet but like a listener, dared her to try. Slowly she lifted her hands and signed, "Come." For a second, nothing happened. Then, Buddy stood, trotted forward, and sat in front of her, lifting his paw as if answering back. The other children gasped, their hands freezing mid-motion. Mia's heart pounded. It had to be a coincidence. She tried again. A different sign. Buddy responded. A ripple of excitement moved through the children as their hands blurred with movement, signing question after question. Could he really understand? Was this real? Buddy stayed where he was, his tail wagging, his head tilting, not confused, but waiting. Mia turned to her friends, her eyes wide with wonder. Her fingers moved as she whispered, "How does he know?" For the first time, the world around them felt a little less silent. A conversation had begun. The town of Brookside moved at its own unhurried pace. It was the kind of place where mail arrived on time, neighbors exchanged nods instead of words, and routine ruled over curiosity. Nothing unusual happened here, at least not the kind of thing that made headlines. Lena Carter had spent years chasing stories in bigger cities, unraveling tales that gripped readers with urgency. But here, news was slow, quiet, until she heard the rumor, a dog that spoke with his paws. At first she laughed it off, a misunderstanding, a case of overexcited storytelling, but something about it stayed with her. Days later, she found herself standing outside an old weathered house on the edge of town, staring at the golden retriever that was supposed to be the center of it all. Buddy sat beside Frank Dawson, an elderly man whose face held the quiet wisdom of years spent in classrooms. Frank had been a teacher before retirement, and now it seemed he had one last student, one that walked on four legs. Lena watched as Frank raised a hand, fingers shifting through a series of movements. Buddy's ears perked, his head tilted. Then he responded. At first Lena thought it was coincidence, but then Frank signed something new. A command. Buddy obeyed. Lena's breath hitched. This wasn't just a trick. This was understanding. Some in town believed Buddy was a miracle, a testament to the unspoken connections between humans and animals. Others dismissed it as conditioning, an overactive imagination, a coincidence stretched too far. Lena wasn't sure what to believe, but she had spent too much time chasing other people's stories, while her own lay buried in silence. Watching Buddy, something stirred deep inside her, a memory she had pushed away for too long. She had once known a boy who spoke with his hands, her younger brother, and she had never learned to listen. Now, standing before a dog who understood what she had never taken the time to learn, guilt settled into her chest. Maybe this wasn't just a story about a dog. Milena sat at her desk, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her tired eyes. The town had told its story, Buddy, the dog who understood sign language. But something still didn't sit right. There had to be more. Dogs didn't just learn to communicate like that on their own. She clicked through digital archives, searching for a thread to pull. A name appeared on an old vet record. Margaret Ellis. The name felt familiar. But why? Her fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing records, scanning through old newspaper clippings. Then she found it. Margaret Ellis, beloved teacher at Brookside School for the Deaf, passed away 6 years ago. Lena's pulse quickened. She wasn't just Buddy's owner, She had been a teacher. The pieces started falling into place. Margaret wasn't just any woman. She had spent decades teaching deaf children to communicate, to bridge the silence with their hands. But she hadn't worked alone. She had trained Buddy alongside them. The retriever had been more than a pet. He had been her partner in teaching. But when Margaret passed away, Buddy had been sent to a shelter, forgotten. No one realized he carried a language. Within him, Lena sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. Buddy hadn't learned to sign because of some lucky accident. He had been waiting for years for someone who understood. She wiped at her cheek, barely realizing she had started to cry. Digging deeper, she found something else. A video link attached to an old article. She clicked play. The screen flickered to life, showing Margaret, her kind smile softening the edges of time, sitting on a classroom floor beside a young Buddy. Her voice was warm, gentle. "Ready, Buddy? Watch my hands." She signed, "Sit." Buddy tilted his head, then obeyed. The children around her clapped, their laughter a soundless joy that still filled the space with warmth. "Good boy, Buddy," Margaret praised, ruffling his fur. "You're going to help a lot of kids one day." Lena pressed a hand to her mouth, her chest tightening. Buddy wasn't just an extraordinary dog. He was a lesson never forgotten, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. And all this time, he had been waiting for someone to listen. Lena's article had started as a local story, a quiet marvel in a quiet town. But now it had grown into something far bigger. National news outlets picked it up, headlines boasting of the dog that speaks with his paws. Some called it a miracle. Others dismissed it as a hoax. And then, the foundation arrived. The Nexus Research Institute for Animal Cognition sent their letter first, a formal request, polite and professional. But it wasn't really a request. They wanted Buddy for scientific study. Their argument was simple. He could change the future of communication. He could advance research in ways no one had imagined. Lena saw through it immediately. This wasn't about understanding. It was about control. Frank Dawson, Buddy's quiet, elderly owner, sat in his worn recliner, the letter trembling in his hands. Across the room, Buddy lay at his feet, his golden fur rising and falling with each peaceful breath. He didn't know he was at the center of a war. Frank exhaled shakily. "They're saying I should do the right thing. Let them take him." "For the greater good," Lena sat forward. "Frank, Buddy isn't an experiment. He's a living being. He belongs here, with you, with the children." Frank swallowed hard. "But what if—" He hesitated, staring down at Buddy. "What if keeping him means holding him back?" The town had begun to take sides. Some believed Buddy should stay, that his bond with the children was too valuable to break. Others argued that he was bigger than Brookside, that he could help researchers unlock discoveries that would change the world. And then there was Dr. Philip Monroe. Dr. Monroe wasn't just any researcher. He had dedicated his career to studying animal cognition. But beneath his polished professionalism was something else, a wound he had never healed. He had a sister once. She had been deaf, and he had never learned to sign. Before he ever understood what silence meant, she was gone. Buddy, to him, wasn't just a research subject. He was an echo of something lost, a bridge to a conversation that had never happened. Frank, weary and overwhelmed, began to consider giving in. Lena knew it. She saw it in the way his shoulders slumped, the way his hands shook when he fed Buddy, as if memorizing every moment before it was taken away. She couldn't let it happen. But how do you convince the world that a dog is more than an experiment? That understanding is more important than discovery? That some things aren't meant to be studied, they're meant to be cherished? The battle had begun, and the fight for Buddy's future was just getting started. The town hall was packed, the air thick with tension. The seats overflowed, forcing people to stand along the walls, whispering, debating, waiting. Voices clashed in heated discussions, some arguing for science and progress, others pleading for family, connection, and love. At the center of it all, Frank Dawson stood, frail but unshaken. His hands gripped the wooden podium, knuckles white, but his voice was steady. "I've lived a long time," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Long enough to know that not everything needs to be studied. Some things are meant to just be." The Foundation's representatives, seated stiffly at the front, shook their heads. A man in a sharp suit, one of their lead scientists, stood. "Mr. Dawson, we're offering to take Buddy somewhere he can help thousands, maybe millions. You have to see that he's bigger than just this town." Frank exhaled. His hands trembled, but his conviction did not. "I see," he said. "I see a dog who has already helped more people than you'll ever understand." A murmur spread through the crowd. Then, a small voice, a little girl, Mia, stepped forward from the aisle, hesitant but determined. The room quieted as she raised her hands, and then she signed, "Watch!" Buddy, who had been sitting patiently at Frank's feet, lifted his head. His golden ears perked. His tail swished once, and then, before the eyes of an entire town, he responded. The room fell into hushed awe. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a trick. This was understanding. The other children stepped forward, their hands moving in fluid motion. A series of signs, one after another, Buddy responded to each. The scientist in the sharp suit opened his mouth, but no words came. And then, Dr. Monroe stood. He had been silent the entire time, watching, absorbing, battling something within himself. Slowly, hesitantly, he raised his own hands. The movement was stiff, unpracticed, but clear. A single word. "Hello." Buddy blinked. Then his head tilted, as if seeing something the others couldn't. A long moment passed. Then, slowly, Buddy raised his paw, and the weight of it all came crashing down. Dr. Monroe's face crumpled. He had spent his life chasing knowledge, proving theories, unlocking mysteries, and all this time the answer had been right in front of him. He had the ability to connect with his sister all along, but he never tried. His breath hitched. His hands trembled at his sides. It wasn't just about Buddy anymore. It was about what he lost and what he could still change. Silence stretched through the room. Then he turned to the Foundation's team and shook his head. "Buddy doesn't belong in a lab," he said, voice breaking. "He belongs here." A wave of relief crashed through the crowd. Tears blurred Frank's vision. Mia beamed. The children signed in rapid joy, their hands flying like birds set free. Dr. Monroe wasn't done. "I can't change the past," he said, "but I can make sure no one else makes my mistake." He turned to Frank. "I'll fund programs, schools, training for dogs like Buddy, whatever it takes." The town erupted in applause, and for the first time, Dr. Monroe truly saw not just a dog, not just science, but the connection he had spent a lifetime searching for. The town of Brookside had changed. It wasn't just the headlines or the news cameras that had once circled like vultures. It was something deeper, something that lingered in the spaces between people. Where once there had been division, doubt, and quiet skepticism, now there was understanding. They gathered in the park that evening, the place where it all began. Children laughed, their hands painting words in the air. Parents watched, no longer just observers, but learners. Signs fluttered between them, as natural as speech. At the center of it all, Buddy sat, tail thumping softly against the grass. His golden fur shimmered in the warm glow of lanterns strung through the trees, his eyes bright, aware, present. He wasn't just a dog. He was a bridge between two worlds. Frank sat on a wooden bench, no longer alone. People surrounded him, old friends, new ones, those who once dismissed him but now saw him for who he was. A man who had opened his heart and, in return, had found family. Lena stood at the edge of the gathering, watching but not yet stepping forward. Something still lingered in her chest, a different kind of silence. She drove for hours the next morning, past familiar roads she had long abandoned. The house was the same, the door, the porch, even the chime when she knocked, but it was the face that greeted her that made the breath hitch in her throat. Her brother stood in the doorway, older, changed, yet still him. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then Lena lifted her hands. Slowly, shakily, she began to sign, a single sentence, a message long overdue. Her brother's eyes widened, and then his hands moved in return. For the first time in years, they spoke. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Buddy lay in the park, watching the world around him. Children ran through the grass. Laughter, both silent and spoken, filled the air. Buddy wasn't waiting anymore. He was home. Frank sat beside him, resting a hand on his golden fur. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You kept your promise, Buddy." And as the first stars flickered into the darkening sky, the world felt a little quieter, a little kinder, and forever changed. Even the smallest act of kindness can bridge a world of silence.